The steel mill closed in 1990, taking with it the rhythmic backdrop of Stillwater life and 600 jobs. Families moved away seeking work, leaving behind empty houses and a diminished tax base. Main Street businesses struggled. The hardware store reduced its hours. The bakery closed entirely. The movie theater converted to a discount outlet that itself failed within a year. The hospital in Ravenswood expanded, drawing patients and doctors away from Mercy, which eventually eliminated its surgical unit and became little more than an urgent care center with a few beds for overnight observation. Through it all, Dr. Maxwell's practice remained, a pillar of stability in a crumbling community. He reduced his fees for former mill workers, accepted payment in goods and services when cash was scarce, and continued the Thursday clinic despite the growing strain on his resources. His silver hair turned white, his stride less vigorous, but his reputation undiminished. If some in Stillwater harbored private doubts about his involvement in Sarah Keller's disappearance, they kept them to themselves. The town needed its heroes, and Maxwell had played the role for too long to be recast as a villain on the basis of circumstantial evidence and troubling inconsistencies. Detective Hargrove transferred to Cincinnati in 1992, but called Rebecca every March 12th, the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance. Their conversations followed the same pattern each year. Any new leads? Never. Any unusual communications? None. Any changes in Maxwell's behavior? Nothing notable. "I haven't forgotten," Hargrove would say before hanging up, the promise both comforting and painful for Rebecca. Someone else remembered Sarah, remembered that her case remained unsolved, but remembering wasn't the same as finding answers. Martha Gaines retired from the medical office in 1998, moving to Florida to live with her daughter. After a mild stroke left her with a slight limp and slurred speech. Before leaving Stillwater, she visited Rebecca at the pharmacy, the first direct contact between the two women since Sarah's disappearance. Martha seemed nervous, her fingers working the clasp of her purse as she stood at the counter, customers moving around her like water around a stone. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about Sarah," she said finally, her voice wavering. "She was a wonderful girl." Rebecca nodded, the familiar ache intensifying at the mention of her daughter's name. "Thank you, Martha." Martha hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as if ensuring a clear escape route. "There's something I should have said years ago about that day." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "The doctor, he was different that morning, agitated. I heard them arguing in his office before I arrived. I pretended I hadn't heard anything, but Sarah sounded upset." Rebecca's hands gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. What were they arguing about? "I couldn't make out the words, just the tone." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I've carried this for so long. I should have told the police then, but he was Dr. Maxwell. Who would have believed me?" "Why tell me now?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the trembling that had started in her core and radiated outward. "Because I'm leaving, and I couldn't go without saying something. And because—" Martha leaned closer. "I found something in his office after Sarah disappeared, a button from her lab coat. It was under his desk. I knew it was hers because it had that little scratch on it. She'd caught it on a drawer once and showed me how it was damaged." Martha reached into her purse and withdrew a small envelope, sliding it across the counter to Rebecca. "I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe as proof that I wasn't imagining things." Rebecca stared at the envelope, but didn't touch it. "Did you tell Detective Hargrove about this?" Martha shook her head. "I was afraid, Dr. Maxwell, that he has influence in this town, even now. And there wasn't anything else, just a button. What would that prove?" "It would prove you had doubts," Rebecca said, her voice hardening. "It might have changed the direction of the investigation." "I know." Martha's shoulders slumped. "I've lived with that knowledge for 11 years. I can't change what I did, or didn't do. But I thought you should have it. Maybe someday it will matter." Rebecca called Hargrove that evening, the conversation unlike any of their annual check-ins. She told him about Martha's visit, about the argument Martha had overheard, about the button found under Maxwell's desk. "It's not enough for a warrant," Hargrove said, frustration evident in his voice. "But it's something. I'll make some calls. See if we can get the case reopened on the basis of new witness testimony." But Martha suffered a second, more severe stroke 2 weeks later, losing her ability to speak. By the time Hargrove arranged to interview her in Florida, she could only communicate through laborious writing on a small whiteboard, her once clear memories fragmented by the damage to her brain. The button was submitted as evidence, but without Martha's testimony about finding it in Maxwell's office, it proved nothing. Sarah had worked there daily. Of course, her belongings might be found in the building. Officer Lampert died of a heart attack in 2003, his case files on Sarah meticulously maintained, but ultimately fruitless. The young deputy who replaced him had never known Sarah, viewed her case as ancient history, a footnote in Stillwater's decline. The Methodist church where Sarah had sung eventually merged with the Presbyterian congregation. As Stillwater's population dwindled, the combined membership barely enough to maintain one building, much less two. Pastor Williams retired, replaced by a series of younger ministers who stayed briefly before moving on to more vibrant communities. Dr. Maxwell, respected and even revered, retired in 2010 after a minor stroke, his reputation as Stillwater's guardian angel intact. His children organized a grand retirement party at the community center, where former patients lined up to share stories of his compassion and skill. Rebecca did not attend, though she received an invitation, a gesture of community solidarity rather than personal connection. She sent it back without response, the envelope unmarked, but its return message clear. Through it all, Rebecca Keller opened the pharmacy each morning, dispensed medications and advice, and kept Sarah's graduation photo behind the counter, a silent witness to the passage of time. She joined a support group for parents of missing children, driving 60 miles to Wheeling once a month, to sit in a church basement with others who understood the unique torture of not knowing. She attended workshops on DNA databases, on forensic advancements, on cold case investigations. She learned the language of a world she had never wanted to enter, became fluent in the terminology of loss without resolution. Every March 12th, she placed a fresh bouquet of daisies, Sarah's favorite, on the empty grave she had eventually established in the Stillwater Cemetery, the headstone reading simply, Sarah Elizabeth Keller, 1964-19, beloved daughter. The question mark was her private rebellion against accepting Sarah's death without proof, a grammatical stand-in for the answers she still sought. Technology evolved. Cold cases gained new attention as DNA testing advanced. In 2015, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation created a specialized unit dedicated to unsolved murders, with aging Detective Hargrove returning from retirement to consult. His hair had turned gray, his tall frame slightly stooped now, but his determination unchanged. He requested Sarah's file as one of the first cases for review, arguing that advanced techniques might yield results where traditional methods had failed. Sarah's lab coat, preserved in an evidence locker for 28 years, was re-examined with techniques that didn't exist when it was found. The blood had degraded beyond the possibility of DNA extraction, but new chemical analyses could detect traces of other substances, a specific brand of aftershave containing ambergris, manufactured between 1982 and 1988 and discontinued thereafter. The sales records no longer existed, but newspaper photographs from community events in 1987 showed Dr. Maxwell wearing the distinctive gold and black bottle on his bathroom shelf, visible in the background of a Gazette feature about his home renovations. The single dark hair, once typed only by blood group, now yielded its genetic secrets. Mitochondrial DNA analysis showed characteristics consistent with Maxwell's maternal lineage, though without a direct sample from Maxwell for comparison, this remained circumstantial. The partial fingerprint on the coat's collar, previously unidentifiable, was run through databases that crossed state lines and decades. It didn't match any known criminal, but its pattern showed distinctive whorls that forensic specialists identified as belonging to someone with a surgical scar across the index finger. Maxwell had such a scar, the result of a childhood accident with a model airplane, as mentioned in the same Gazette profile that had revealed his aftershave preferences. None of this was enough for an arrest, but it justified reopening the investigation. Hargrove's cold case unit began systematically re-interviewing surviving witnesses, re-examining physical evidence, and building a circumstantial case against the retired physician. Maxwell, now living in a lakeside retirement community 30 miles from Stillwater, declined all requests for interviews, his lawyer citing his age and health concerns. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. In 2018, the Maxwell family practice building was sold to a real estate developer planning to convert the downtown block into apartments. a last-ditch effort to revitalize Stillwater's struggling economy. During renovations, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall in what had been Dr. Maxwell's private office, a space just large enough to hold a small safe. The construction foreman, mindful of Stillwater's history and the rumors that had never quite died, called the police before allowing anyone to touch it. Detective Hargrove arrived within hours, armed with a warrant and a forensic team. The safe, an older model without digital protections, was opened on site. Inside, a silver charm bracelet with a caduceus pendant, identified by Rebecca as Sarah's 21st birthday gift from her co-workers at the pharmacy. A notebook in Sarah's handwriting, the final entry dated March 12, 1987. Dr. M insists I accompany him to hospital today. Says it's time I see how a real surgeon works. Something feels off about this. We'll discuss with Mum tonight. And most damning, a collection of photographs of Sarah Keller taken without her knowledge. Sarah studying at the library. Sarah hanging laundry on her apartment balcony. Sarah asleep on what appeared to be an examination table. A syringe visible at the edge of the frame. It was 3:42 a.m. when Rebecca Keller's phone rang, cutting through 34 years of silence. She was already awake, as she often was at this hour. Insomnia had been her constant companion since 1987. The old rotary phone on her nightstand rarely rang anymore. Most people used her cell phone now. But this line, Sarah's line, she had never disconnected. Her hand trembled as she reached for the receiver. Something in her knowing, the way mothers always know, that this call would finally answer the question that had hollowed out her existence since that March morning. The small bedside lamp cast long shadows across the faded floral wallpaper, unchanged since the day Sarah never came home. Rebecca had preserved this room like a museum to waiting. The wallpaper Sarah had helped her hang the summer before college, the quilt Sarah's grandmother had stitched, the framed nursing school diploma that had arrived 3 weeks after the disappearance. The room smelled of dust and lavender sachets and that peculiar emptiness that accumulates in spaces where time has stopped moving forward. Mrs. Keller, this is Detective Hargrove from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. The voice had aged, but carried the same steady resolve she remembered from hundreds of conversations at her kitchen table. Her fingers tightened around the receiver, the plastic warm against her palm. We've made an arrest in your daughter's case. The world contracted to those 7 words. Rebecca's vision narrowed. Her breath caught somewhere between her throat and lungs. Outside her window, an unseasonable April snow fell silently on the streets of Stillwater, Ohio, just as it had the night Sarah's white lab coat was found behind Mercy Hospital, stained with what tests would later confirm was her blood. Through the sheer curtains, she could see the snowflakes illuminated by the single street lamp on Maple Avenue, each one unique, perfect, ephemeral, like the 34 years that had passed in a blur of waiting. Dr. Maxwell, she whispered, not a question but a statement. It had always been him in her heart. A mother knows. Yes, Hargrove replied, the word heavy with confirmation. We found her, Rebecca. She did not ask if Sarah was alive. That hope had died decades ago, buried beneath layers of grief that had calcified into a dull, persistent ache. Instead, she asked, where? The lake behind his retirement home. I'm so sorry. Rebecca watched another snowflake land on her window pane, clinging briefly before melting into oblivion. I'll be ready in 20 minutes, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I want to see him brought in. What began on a Tuesday morning in March 1987, when Sarah Keller walked the 3 blocks to her job at Dr. Maxwell's office, was finally reaching its conclusion. Stillwater, Ohio, 1987. Our town carved into the rolling hills of Appalachian coal country, where the steel mill's whistle divided the day into neat compartments, and where the Ohio River carried secrets downstream before anyone thought to look for them. A place where train tracks cut through the center of Main Street, where families measured their history in generations rather than years, and where the church bells from St. Augustine's competed with the mill's shift change siren every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. In 1987, Stillwater still believed in itself, despite the recession that had closed the smaller factories and sent young people seeking work in Cincinnati and Columbus. The steel mill, Stillwater Foundry and Metal, remained the town's beating heart, employing nearly 600 people across 3 shifts. The downtown storefront still housed locally owned businesses. Caldwell's Bakery, with its glass cases of glazed donuts and cinnamon rolls, Grissom's Hardware, where monthly tabs were still recorded in a leather-bound ledger, Marshall's Pharmacy, where Rebecca Keller had worked since high school, and which she had owned since her husband's death, and a dozen other establishments that formed the commercial backbone of the community. It was a town where everyone knew Dr. James Maxwell, the town physician who had delivered half of Stillwater's children over his 40-year practice, who ran the free clinic on Thursday evenings for mill workers without insurance, and whose Christmas donations kept the library open when the county threatened budget cuts. His office occupied the stately Victorian on the corner of Elm and Chestnut, its white columns and wraparound porch a symbol of stability in a changing world. Inside, the waiting room featured photographs of Maxwell with 3 different Ohio governors, a framed medical degree from Johns Hopkins, and hundreds of crayon drawings from young patients who viewed trips to the doctor with excitement rather than dread, thanks to the jar of butterscotch candies that always sat on his desk. Dr. Maxwell's reputation was as pristine as the white coat he wore for 40 years, a man whose perfect posture and silver hair inspired confidence, whose steady hands had performed emergency surgeries in the most primitive conditions during the flood of '72, and whose involvement with the school board had modernized the science curriculum against considerable opposition. He had survived the loss of his wife to cancer in 1980 with dignified grief, throwing himself into his practice and community service. When the new hospital in Ravenswood threatened to siphon patients away from Mercy, it was Maxwell who organized the campaign to fund a new surgical wing, donating the first $20,000 himself. Sarah Keller had grown up watching her mother manage the town's only pharmacy, developing an early fascination with medicine that led her to nursing school and back home to work as Dr. Maxwell's surgical assistant. She was exactly the kind of young person Stillwater feared losing, bright, ambitious, community-minded. That she had chosen to return, even temporarily, was seen as an affirmation that Stillwater still had something to offer the younger generation. At 23, Sarah lived in a small apartment above Grissom's Hardware, a walk-up with uneven floors and tall windows that overlooked Main Street. She saved her tips from weekend shifts at the River Road Diner in a mason jar labeled Medical School, written in her precise, slightly slanted handwriting. She called her mother every night at 9 precisely, a routine established during her nursing school years, and maintained with the same dedication she applied to everything in her life. Though she had dated occasionally, the basketball coach at the high school briefly, and the young lawyer who had recently joined the practice on Court Street, Sarah's focus remained on her professional goals. "The right relationship will happen when it's meant to," she told her mother. "Right now I need to concentrate on getting into medical school." Sarah collected vintage medical textbooks, found at estate sales and library fundraisers, lined neatly on the shelves her mother's second husband had built before his death. She wore her grandfather's pocket watch on a chain around her neck, the only item she had inherited from the stern, taciturn man who had moved to Stillwater to work in the steel mill in 1934. She sang in the Methodist church choir, her clear soprano rising above the congregation during hymns, though she confided to her mother that she found more spiritual connection in the quiet rhythm of hospital corridors than in organized religion. She had a habit of tucking her hair behind her right ear when she concentrated, leaving half-finished cups of tea on every available surface, and keeping detailed notes of Dr. Maxwell's procedures in a leather-bound journal, hoping to reference them when she became a doctor herself. Her handwriting was neat and precise, her observations astute, her questions incisive. "Sarah has the mind of a diagnostician," Dr. Maxwell told Rebecca during a chance meeting at the grocery store, 3 weeks before the disappearance. "She sees patterns others miss." His smile had been proud, paternal, his hand resting briefly on Rebecca's shoulder in the way of old family friends. "She'll make a fine doctor someday." Sarah's ambition seemed boundless in a town where most young people either left or resigned themselves to the rhythm of shift work at the mill, the predictable progression of marriage, mortgage, and children. She spoke of specializing in pediatric surgery, of working in urban hospitals where she could serve underprivileged communities, of eventually returning to Stillwater to establish a proper children's clinic. She had applied to 3 medical schools for the fall semester and spent her evenings studying for the MCAT, falling asleep with textbooks spread across her bed and waking before dawn to review more material before her shifts at the doctor's office. "Sarah's the kind of girl who makes you believe in people again," Pastor Williams had said at her memorial service. When hope of finding her alive had faded, like the search posters that still hung, sun-bleached and rain-warped, in the windows of Main Street businesses 3 months after her disappearance. The poster showed Sarah as she had been, smiling confidently in her graduation gown from Mount Mercy Nursing School, dark hair falling in soft waves around a face that radiated determination. She had her father's eyes, everyone said, though Thomas Keller had been dead 5 years by then, his heart giving out during a midnight shift at the steel mill, leaving Rebecca to raise their only daughter alone. The eyes that looked out from those posters seemed to follow Rebecca as she walked the streets of Stillwater, a daily reminder of the life interrupted. Sometimes in the pharmacy at night, she would catch herself listening for the bell above the door, expecting Sarah to breeze in with a coffee for her mother and stories from the doctor's office, the hypochondriac who came in weekly with a new self-diagnosed disease, the child who had swallowed a marble, the elderly man who brought homemade blackberry preserves in gratitude for Dr. Maxwell's house calls. Those stories had always been told with affection and professional discretion, Sarah's respect for Dr. Maxwell evident in every anecdote. Had there been signs? Rebecca tortured herself with this question in the months and years that followed. Had Sarah's attitude toward her mentor changed? Had there been discomfort in her voice when she spoke of him? Had she missed some crucial shift in their professional relationship? The questions accumulated like dust on the untouched surfaces of Sarah's room in Rebecca's house, the bedroom preserved exactly as it had been during her high school years, before the apartment above Grissom's, before the nursing degree, before everything changed. On March 12, 1987, Sarah left her apartment at 7:15 a.m. The morning was crisp but sunny, the kind of early spring day that promises warmth without delivering it. She wore her blue wool coat over a white blouse and navy skirt, sensible shoes for the 3-block walk to the doctor's office, and a red scarf her mother had knitted for Christmas. Mrs. Donovan, who lived in the apartment across the hall and left early for her job at the telephone company, remembered Sarah checking her mailbox in the building's narrow entryway. She seemed excited about something, Mrs. Donovan later told police, said she was expecting an important letter. Sarah stopped at Caldwell's bakery at 7:22, according to the statement Frank Caldwell gave police. The bakery opened at 5:30 to catch the mill workers heading to first shift, and by the time Sarah arrived, the morning rush had subsided. She ordered her usual, coffee with cream, no sugar, and a cinnamon roll, and chatted with Mrs. Caldwell about the upcoming spring festival, while Frank boxed an extra pastry for Dr. Maxwell, he recalled. She always brought him something sweet on Thursdays, said it was his busiest day with the free clinic and all. Sarah mentioned a new medical journal Dr. Maxwell had lent her, something about advancements in microsurgery. She was so excited about some new surgical procedure, Mrs. Caldwell would later tell police, said the doctor was letting her observe more operations lately. She said, "I'm finally seeing how it all works." I remember thinking how proud she looked, like a kid who'd been invited to sit at the grown-up table. The Caldwells were the last civilians to speak with Sarah. At 7:32, security camera footage from First National Bank across from Maxwell family practice showed Sarah walking into the back entrance of the office building, her red scarf bright against the grey morning, the bakery box balanced carefully in one hand. The timestamp on that grainy black and white footage became the dividing line between Sarah's known life and the mystery that followed, the last confirmed sighting of Sarah Keller alive. Martha Gaines, the office receptionist, arrived at 7:45 to find the lights already on, Sarah's coat hanging on the rack, and a fresh pot of coffee brewing in the small kitchenette where staff took their breaks. Dr. Maxwell's private office door was closed, as it often was when he reviewed files before seeing patients. Martha noted nothing unusual about the morning. She arranged the waiting room magazines, turned on the radio to the easy listening station Dr. Maxwell preferred, and prepared for the first patient at 8:30. Sarah's absence from the front office wasn't immediately concerning. She often helped Dr. Maxwell with filing or inventory before patients arrived. But when 9:00 came, and the waiting room filled without Sarah emerging to call patients back or take vitals, Martha knocked tentatively on Dr. Maxwell's door. The doctor said Sarah had gone to the hospital to arrange some paperwork for a surgery that afternoon, Martha later testified. It seemed perfectly normal. She often handled the hospital administrative work. The morning passed without incident. Dr. Maxwell saw 15 patients between 8:30 and noon, mostly routine checkups, a child with an ear infection, an elderly man renewing prescriptions. At 12:15, he informed Martha that he had emergency surgery at Mercy Hospital and would be cancelling his afternoon appointments. He seemed rushed but not upset, Martha recalled. He said Sarah had called from the hospital about a complication with a patient and that he needed to perform surgery immediately. I asked if Sarah would be returning to help me reschedule the appointments, and he said she'd be assisting him at the hospital for the rest of the day. At 5:45 p.m., Rebecca Keller called the office when Sarah didn't answer her home phone, a break in the routine of their 9 p.m. calls that Sarah had never mentioned. Martha, still at the office finishing the day's filing, explained that Sarah had left around noon with Dr. Maxwell for emergency surgery. "I'm sure she'll call when they're finished," Martha assured Rebecca. "These things sometimes run long." When Rebecca called Mercy Hospital at 6:30, no one had seen either Sarah or Dr. Maxwell. No emergency surgery had been scheduled or performed. The growing knot of fear in Rebecca's stomach tightened. She called Sarah's apartment, then the diner where Sarah sometimes picked up extra shifts, then 3 of Sarah's closest friends. No one had seen her. By 8 p.m., Rebecca had filed a missing persons report with Officer Dennis Lampert, who had known Sarah since she was a pigtailed girl selling Girl Scout cookies door to door. "She's probably just out with friends," Lampert had said in the police station's fluorescent-lit waiting room, though his eyes betrayed his concern. Maybe she and the doc had to go to Ravenswood Hospital for the surgery instead. But his fingers were already dialing Ravenswood, even as he offered these reassurances. Small towns keep their secrets, but they know their own, and Sarah Keller had never missed a call to her mother without explanation. By 10 p.m., Rebecca had reached Dr. Maxwell at his home, the sprawling Victorian on Hillside Avenue that had once housed his wife and 2 children, both now living out of state. His voice on the phone was concerned but professional. He had dropped Sarah at Mercy Hospital around noon, he explained, and continued to a house call in neighboring Preston County. When he returned to the hospital around 4, the surgery had been cancelled, and he assumed Sarah had gone home. He expressed surprise that she hadn't called Rebecca, but suggested that perhaps she had gone out with hospital staff afterward. "Young people," he said with the indulgent chuckle of an older man who has seen generations come and go. "They make plans on a moment's notice." The search began casually at first. Calls to friends, checks at the bus station, a drive along the river road where teenagers sometimes parked. By midnight, when Sarah still hadn't returned home or contacted her mother, Officer Lampert had organized a more formal search. Volunteers gathered at the Methodist Church, where Pastor Williams offered a brief prayer before groups dispersed throughout Stillwater, flashlights cutting through the darkness as they called Sarah's name. Dr. Maxwell joined the volunteers immediately, arriving at the church in his Cadillac, still wearing his white coat. His authoritative voice directed search parties along the wooded path between his office and the hospital, a shortcut Sarah sometimes took when the weather was nice. She might have felt ill and stopped to rest, he suggested, his flashlight beam cutting through the unexpected snowfall that had begun around 10 p.m., delicate flakes that erased any traces that might have been left behind. These woods can be disorienting in the dark. The search continued through the night, expanding to include the riverbanks, the abandoned quarry north of town, and the fields surrounding the steel mill. Police from neighboring counties joined the effort at dawn, bringing tracking dogs that lost Sarah's scent at the hospital parking lot. It was as if she had simply vanished, stepped out of her life between the doctor's office and Mercy Hospital, leaving no trace beyond the security camera footage that showed her arriving at work that morning. It was Elijah Washington, a hospital janitor working the night shift, who found the lab coat at 6:17 a.m., half hidden behind a dumpster in the hospital's rear service area. The white fabric stood out against the brick wall, visible only because the overnight snowfall had covered the surrounding trash, but had been blocked from covering the coat by the dumpster's overhang. The embroidered name S. Keller was still visible on the pocket, despite the dark stains that spread across the white fabric like a disease. The snow had protected it from the elements, preserved it like evidence in a freezer, waiting to tell its story. Preliminary tests confirmed what everyone feared. The dark stains were blood, and a lot of it, type AB negative, matching Sarah's rare blood type. No other evidence was found near the dumpster. No purse, no scarf, no sign of struggle beyond the coat itself. The single dark hair caught in the third button of the coat was bagged as evidence, its significance not yet apparent. 2 partial fingerprints were lifted from the coat's collar, one matching Sarah's prints taken from her nursing school records, the other smudged and unidentifiable with 1987 technology. The investigation consumed Stillwater through the spring of 1987. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area behind Mercy Hospital where the coat was found. The lab at the county seat ran tests on the blood, confirming that the volume suggested a life-threatening injury. Search parties combed the woods and riverbanks daily, then weekly, then monthly. As hope faded, Sarah's photograph appeared on local news broadcasts, then regional ones, then briefly on a national program about missing persons. Calls came in from neighboring states, sightings that led nowhere, theories that dissolved under scrutiny. Detective Roy Hargrove arrived from the Bureau of Criminal Investigation 2 days after Sarah's disappearance, a young, methodical officer with a reputation for solving cases others had given up on. Tall and angular, with penetrating grey eyes and a quiet manner that drew confessions from the most reluctant witnesses, Hargrove approached the case with professional detachment that gradually evolved into personal commitment. He interviewed every hospital employee, every patient seen at Maxwell's practice that day, every person who might have seen Sarah. His notebook filled with statements, timelines, discrepancies. "There's always someone who sees something," he would tell Rebecca during their weekly meetings at her kitchen table, where steam rose from untouched coffee cups as they reviewed the case again and again. "It's just a matter of asking the right questions." But no one had seen Sarah at the hospital that day. No surgery had been scheduled for Dr. Maxwell. The house call in Preston County couldn't be verified. The patient had died 2 days after Sarah's disappearance, a fact that struck Hargrove as convenient, but not necessarily suspicious. The first crack in Dr. Maxwell's account came from an unexpected source: 14-year-old Tommy Burke, who had been skipping school in the wooded area behind the hospital that morning. Tommy hadn't come forward initially, fearing punishment for truancy, but his conscience eventually outweighed his fear. "I saw Dr. Maxwell's car parked in the service lot around 11:30, he told Hargrove in an interview at the police station, his mother sitting anxiously beside him. "I was up in my fort in the big oak tree and I could see over the fence. He was alone when he went in the back door. When he came out maybe 15 minutes later, he was carrying something to his trunk, something heavy. I couldn't see what it was from where I was." This contradicted Maxwell's statement that he had driven Sarah to the hospital at noon and dropped her at the main entrance. When confronted with this discrepancy, Maxwell amended his timeline. Perhaps it had been earlier, he suggested, around 11:30. Perhaps he had gone in through the service entrance to drop off some equipment, while Sarah went to the main entrance to deal with paperwork. The inconsistencies were troubling but not damning. Dr. Maxwell was questioned 3 times in the months following Sarah's disappearance. Each time, he expressed profound grief over his young assistant's disappearance, offering to increase the reward money from his personal savings. His home was searched, yielding nothing suspicious. His car, a 1985 Cadillac Seville, was examined for evidence. A few dark hairs were found in the trunk, but they matched Maxwell's own hair, not Sarah's. "Sarah was like a daughter to me," he told the Stillwater Gazette in May, his voice breaking appropriately during the interview, his eyes moist but composed. "I've watched her grow from a curious child into a promising medical professional. This community has lost a bright light." The Gazette ran the story on the front page, alongside a photograph of Maxwell comforting Rebecca at a candlelight vigil in the town square. His arm rested protectively around her shoulders, his expression a mask of paternal concern. The image cemented his role in the community's narrative, not as a suspect, but as a second grieving parent. His alibi, though imperfect, was supported by his untarnished reputation and 3 decades of service to Stillwater. The investigation stalled. Without a body, without witnesses, without concrete evidence linking anyone to Sarah's disappearance, the case remained officially open, but effectively dormant by the end of 1987. Months passed. The searches grew smaller, less frequent, until they stopped altogether. Sarah's apartment was eventually cleared out, her books and half-finished cups of tea packed into boxes that found their way to Rebecca's attic. Her clothes were donated to a women's shelter in the next county, her furniture sold to pay off the remaining lease. Life in Stillwater continued. Babies were born, old people died, teenagers graduated and moved away or settled into jobs at the steel mill. Rebecca kept the pharmacy open, existing in that half-life that belongs to those who have lost children to uncertainty rather than death, a special kind of purgatory where grief has no permission to complete itself. Dr. Maxwell continued his practice, though he never hired another young female assistant. His nurse was now Mrs. Abernathy, a grandmother of 5 with grey hair and orthopedic shoes, who had come out of retirement to help him after Sarah's disappearance. "The doctor hasn't been the same," she confided to customers at the pharmacy. "He blames himself for sending her to the hospital alone that day." Rebecca avoided the doctor's office, having her prescriptions filled by the new physician who had opened a practice across town. She couldn't bear to see the place where Sarah had last been seen, couldn't cross the threshold without imagining her daughter's final moments there. What had happened between 7:32 a.m. when Sarah entered that building and whenever she had left it for the last time? The question haunted Rebecca's dreams, woke her gasping for air in the middle of the night, the sheets tangled around her legs like restraints. Months passed. The searches grew smaller, less frequent, until they stopped altogether. Sarah's apartment was eventually cleared out, her books and half-finished cups of tea packed into boxes that found their way to Rebecca's attic. The steel mill closed in 1990, taking with it the rhythmic backdrop of Stillwater life. Dr. Maxwell continued his practice, though he never hired another young female assistant. Rebecca kept the pharmacy open, existing in that half-life that belongs to those who have lost children to uncertainty rather than death, a special kind of purgatory where grief has no permission to complete itself. Detective Hargrove transferred to Cincinnati in 1992, but called Rebecca every March 12th. Martha Gaines retired from the medical office in 1998. Officer Lampert died of a heart attack in 2003, his case files on Sarah meticulously maintained, but ultimately fruitless. The Methodist Church, where Sarah had sung, eventually merged with the Presbyterian congregation as Stillwater's population dwindled. Dr. Maxwell, respected and even revered, retired in 2010 after a minor stroke, his reputation as Stillwater's guardian angel intact. Through it all, Rebecca Keller opened the pharmacy each morning, dispensed medications and advice, and kept Sarah's graduation photo behind the counter, a silent witness to the passage of time. Technology evolved. Cold cases gained new attention as DNA testing advanced. In 2015, the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation created a specialized unit dedicated to unsolved murders, with aging Detective Hargrove returning from retirement to consult. Sarah's lab coat, preserved in an evidence locker for 28 years, was re-examined with techniques that didn't exist when it was found. The single dark hair, once typed only by blood group, now yielded its genetic secrets. The partial fingerprint on the coat's collar, previously unidentifiable, was run through databases that crossed state lines and decades. In 2018, the Maxwell family practice building was sold to a real estate developer, planning to convert the downtown block into apartments. During renovations, workers discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall in what had been Dr. Maxwell's private office, a space just large enough to hold a small safe. Inside, a silver charm bracelet with a caduceus pendant, identified by Rebecca as Sarah's 21st birthday gift from her co-workers. A notebook in Sarah's handwriting, the final entry dated March 12, 1987. "Dr. M insists I accompany him to hospital today. Says it's time I see how a real surgeon works. Something feels off about this. We'll discuss with Mom tonight." And most damning, a collection of photographs of Sarah Keller taken without her knowledge. Sarah studying at the library, Sarah hanging laundry on her apartment balcony, Sarah asleep on what appeared to be an examination table. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling enough to warrant a new look at Dr. James Maxwell, now 78, and living in a lakeside retirement community 30 miles from Stillwater. His health had declined since retirement. The stroke had left him with a slight paralysis on his left side, and subsequent years had added diabetes, hypertension, and early-stage dementia, according to medical records subpoenaed by Hargrove's team. But in photographs from community events at the retirement village, Maxwell appeared alert and engaged, his diminished physical capabilities belied by the sharp intelligence still evident in his eyes. Hargrove compiled a meticulous case file, the new forensic evidence from the lab coat, Martha Gaines's statement from 1998, preserved in his personal notes, though never formally added to the police record, the contradictory accounts of Maxwell's movements on the day of Sarah's disappearance, and now the damning contents of the hidden safe. The district attorney reviewed the evidence and authorized a warrant for DNA collection from Maxwell, a simple cheek swab that would confirm or rule out the connection between the hair found on Sarah's coat and the retired doctor. Detective Hargrove, his hair now white but his determination unchanged, obtained a warrant for Dr. Maxwell's DNA on April 2nd, 2021. He drove to the retirement community himself, unwilling to delegate this crucial task to younger officers who lacked his history with the case. The facility director met him at the entrance, her expression concerned as she explained that Dr. Maxwell had been increasingly withdrawn in recent weeks, skipping meals and community activities. "He's had visitors," she mentioned, as she led Hargrove through carpeted hallways smelling of disinfectant and cafeteria food. "Family, I think. His son was here last weekend from Seattle, stayed for several days." Dr. Maxwell seemed agitated afterward. Maxwell's apartment was at the end of a long corridor overlooking the small man-made lake that gave the community its name, Lakeside Gardens. The door was answered by a home health aide who explained that the doctor was having one of his better days, but tired easily. She ushered Hargrove into a sitting room decorated with medical diplomas, family photographs, and the accumulated memorabilia of a long career. Maxwell sat in a leather armchair by the window, a plaid blanket across his legs despite the spring warmth, his hands resting on a book of crossword puzzles. He looked up as Hargrove entered, recognition flickering across features that had grown gaunt with age. "Detective," he said, his voice weaker but still carrying that note of authority that had commanded respect in Stillwater for decades. "I wondered when you'd come." The DNA collection took less than a minute, a sterile swab against the inside of Maxwell's cheek, sealed in an evidence container, the necessary forms signed with a hand that trembled slightly but followed the lines with precision. Maxwell asked no questions about the purpose of the sample, offered no resistance to the procedure. His compliance was unnerving, almost as if he had been expecting this moment, preparing for it through years of successful evasion. As Hargrove prepared to leave, Maxwell spoke again. "How is Rebecca?" he asked, his tone conversational, as if inquiring after an old friend rather than the mother of a woman he was now formally suspected of harming. "Mrs. Keller is still waiting for answers," Hargrove replied, his professional demeanor masking the anger that had simmered for 34 years. Maxwell nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the lake beyond his window. "Waiting is its own kind of prison, isn't it? For all of us." His fingers traced the pattern on his blanket, following some invisible path only he could see. "I've been waiting too, Detective." Hargrove left with the DNA sample and a growing sense of unease. Maxwell's demeanor suggested neither guilt nor innocence, but something more disturbing, a detachment from the moral weight of the situation, as if Sarah's disappearance were a clinical case study rather than a human tragedy. On April 3rd, 2021, laboratory technicians confirmed what some in Stillwater had silently suspected for decades. The hair found on Sarah's lab coat belonged to James Maxwell. The partial fingerprint, while not definitive enough for court purposes, showed consistent patterns with a sample taken during the recent DNA collection. The search for Sarah's body could now proceed with renewed focus. Hargrove obtained warrants for Maxwell's retirement home, his former residence in Stillwater, now occupied by a young family unconnected to the case, and several properties owned by Maxwell's family trust, including a hunting cabin in southern Ohio and a small parcel of undeveloped land adjacent to the lake behind the retirement community. It was this last location that drew Hargrove's particular attention. Purchased by Maxwell just 6 months after his retirement, its proximity to his new residence suggesting convenience rather than recreational value. The arrest came at dawn on April 4th, exactly 34 years and 23 days after Sarah disappeared. Dr. Maxwell was taken into custody without resistance, his expression betraying neither surprise nor remorse, as officers helped him from bed into a wheelchair and then into the police vehicle. His lawyer met them at the county jail, arranging for medical accommodations, appropriate for an elderly man with multiple health issues. Maxwell was processed, photographed and placed in the medical unit. The charges read in formal language that reduced Sarah's life and death to legal terminology: kidnapping, false imprisonment, murder in the first degree. The community that had revered him watched in stunned silence as the story unfolded on local news. their beloved doctor charged with the kidnapping and murder of his young assistant 3 decades earlier. Former patients gathered in small groups at Stillwater's remaining diner, their coffee growing cold as they shared memories that now took on darker significance. Maxwell's preference for young female assistants before Sarah, his insistence on private examinations for teenage girls, his habit of sedating patients for minor procedures, what had once seemed like quirks of a small-town doctor from an older generation now appeared as warning signs, ignored in favor of the comforting narrative of the devoted physician. Rebecca Keller received the news of Maxwell's arrest from Hargrove himself, who drove to her home before the media could break the story. She sat motionless at her kitchen table as he explained the evidence, the charges, the process that would follow. Her hands, lined now with age and marked by decades of dispensing medicines to her neighbors, remained perfectly still on the wooden surface where she had once helped Sarah with homework, where they had shared meals and dreams and the ordinary conversations that become precious only in retrospect. "Will he tell us where she is?" she asked finally. The question that had haunted her for 34 years, distilled to its essential concern. "We're hoping," Hargrove replied, unable to offer certainty even now. "The DA is discussing a plea arrangement. If he leads us to Sarah, they might consider his age and health in sentencing." Rebecca's expression hardened. "No deals," she said firmly. "Not after all this time, not after what he took from her, from me." The lake behind Maxwell's retirement home was drained on April 12th, a process that took 3 days and involved environmental specialists to minimize impact on the local ecosystem. On the 4th day, as mud began to replace water and specialized cadaver dogs were brought to the scene, the first evidence emerged: a hospital blanket, the faded blue fabric still bearing the embroidered Mercy Hospital logo, protruding from the thickest area of silt near the lake's deepest point. Sarah's remains were recovered from its muddy bottom, wrapped in the hospital blanket, weighted down with surgical equipment that had been reported stolen from Mercy Hospital days after her disappearance. Scalpels, clamps, a surgical tray, all neatly arranged as if for a procedure. The skeleton was nearly complete, protected from scavengers and weather by its underwater tomb and the careful wrapping. A gold chain with a small heart pendant still circled the cervical vertebrae, a Christmas gift from Rebecca that Sarah had worn daily, visible in every recent photograph of her. The cause of death, a precisely administered injection of potassium chloride, untraceable in 1987, but evident in the preserved tissue samples through modern forensic techniques that could detect changes to the bone consistent with sudden cardiac arrest. A medical professional's murder, executed with clinical detachment. Confronted with the evidence and the discovery of Sarah's body, Maxwell's attorney approached the district attorney about a plea agreement. On April 30th, in a small conference room at the county courthouse, James Maxwell formally confessed to the murder of Sarah Keller. His statement, recorded and witnessed by Hargrove, Rebecca, and representatives from the prosecutor's office, was delivered in the same measured tones he had once used to explain medical procedures to anxious patients. "Sarah discovered my journal," he began, his gaze fixed on some middle distance, avoiding the eyes of those gathered to hear his confession. "I kept detailed records of my observations of female patients. Had for years. Nothing physical, you understand. Just observations. Measurements, reactions to various medications, a private research project." Hargrove's pen scratched across his notepad, documenting the confession with the same attention to detail he had applied to the case for decades. Maxwell continued, his voice academic, detached. "That morning, March 12th, she confronted me with what she'd found, said she'd been searching for a reference text in my office after hours and came across the hidden cabinet where I kept my records. She was distressed. Said she had to report me to the medical board." A flicker of emotion crossed his face, not remorse but something closer to annoyance at the memory of being challenged. She didn't understand the importance of the work, the patterns I was documenting. She was going to ruin decades of research with her moral objections. Rebecca's breath caught audibly, but she remained composed, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes never leaving Maxwell's face. "I suggested we discuss it at the hospital away from Martha's prying ears. I administered a mild sedative, told her it was a vitamin injection, standard practice in my office. The patients never questioned it. Once she was compliant, I took her to my car. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty. Shift change, you know. No one saw us. His clinical recitation faltered slightly. She was starting to come around when we reached the lake. I hadn't planned to end things. But she became agitated, said she had already mailed copies of certain pages to the State Medical Board. The flicker of annoyance returned. She was lying, of course, trying to protect herself, but I couldn't take the risk. The potassium chloride was in my medical bag, for emergencies, officially. It stops the heart almost instantly when administered intravenously. No pain, no violence. She just stopped. His hands, once steady enough to perform delicate surgeries, trembled slightly as he mimed an injection. I wrapped her in the blanket from my car, always kept one for emergencies. The lake was deeper then. I calculated that decomposition would be minimal in the cold water, that any evidence would be obscured. Her lab coat, Hargrove prompted, when Maxwell fell silent, lost in his methodical reconstruction of the murder. Yes, it had blood on it. She struck her head on the car door when I was moving her. I discarded it behind the hospital, intending to retrieve it later. But then that janitor found it. He shook his head. The first indication of something approaching regret, though seemingly more for his tactical error than for Sarah's death. "Why keep her things?" Rebecca asked suddenly, her voice steady despite the horror of hearing her daughter's final moments described with such clinical detachment. "Why risk hiding the bracelet, the notebook, the photographs?" Maxwell looked at her directly for the first time, something almost like recognition flitting across his features. "I kept records of all my subjects," he said simply, as if this explained everything. Sarah was special. She had such potential. I was mentoring her. The photographs were part of my documentation of her development. A pause, then, with an unsettling attempt at reassurance. "She didn't suffer, Rebecca. It was quick, clinical, the way she would have wanted it as a medical professional." Rebecca stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scream. Without a word, she left the room, the door closing behind her with quiet finality. The trial lasted 6 weeks, revealing the carefully constructed facade of Stillwater's most trusted citizen. Former patients came forward with stories of inappropriate behavior dismissed as old-fashioned bedside manner. A nurse who had briefly worked for Maxwell in 1985 described finding a hidden camera in the women's changing room. Police discovered journals dating back to 1975, detailing Maxwell's obsessions with young women in his care, Sarah being only the last and most fatally fixated upon. The prosecution built a case that went beyond Sarah's murder, exposing decades of voyeuristic behavior, unauthorized sedation, and a pattern of selecting vulnerable female employees who depended on his mentorship and references for their careers. On the witness stand, Martha Gaines finally revealed what she had kept silent for 3 decades. "I saw him watching her, not like a mentor watches a student, like a hunter watches prey." Her testimony, delivered via video from the assisted living facility where she now resided, her speech still slurred from her strokes, but her memory of that time painfully clear, carried the weight of decades of regret. He would stand in the doorway of the break room while she ate lunch, just observing, taking mental notes. I'd catch him measuring the circumference of her wrist with his fingers during staff meetings, writing down the numbers in that little notebook he carried. She had said nothing in 1987 because who would believe me over Dr. Maxwell? He delivered their babies, he saved their lives, he was Stillwater, and I was just a receptionist. Her eyes, magnified by thick glasses, filled with tears. "I've carried this guilt for 34 years. I should have spoken up. Maybe Sarah would still be alive if I had been braver." Maxwell's defense focused on his current health issues, the dementia that supposedly clouded his memory, the physical ailments that had reduced the once commanding figure to a frail old man in a wheelchair. His son, a software executive from Seattle, testified about his father's confusion and disorientation, the episodes where he didn't recognize family members, the moments of paranoia that characterized his declining years. But the prosecution systematically dismantled this portrayal with evidence of Maxwell's selective memory, his perfect recall of medical procedures and patient histories when interviewed by facility staff, his continued participation in the retirement community's chess club, where he regularly defeated opponents decades younger, his detailed financial instructions to his accountant just weeks before his arrest. The journal entries recovered from the safe showed a methodical mind documenting Sarah's movements, appearance, and conversations with disturbing precision. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. When the verdict was read, Rebecca Keller sat motionless in the courtroom, her hands folded around Sarah's silver charm bracelet, the caduceus pendant catching the fluorescent light as it dangled between her fingers. Dr. Maxwell, his professional demeanor finally cracking, turned to face her from his wheelchair at the defense table. "She would have ruined everything," he said, his voice carrying in the silent courtroom, years of calculated civility giving way to the raw entitlement beneath. "She found my journals. She knew what I was. She had no right to judge my work." It was the only explanation he would ever offer, a glimpse into a mind that had prioritized his research over a young woman's life, that had valued his reputation above basic humanity. The judge sentenced Maxwell to life imprisonment, acknowledging that given his age and health, this would likely mean only a few years in the medical unit of the state penitentiary. "But the sentence," she noted, "is less significant than the truth that has finally been revealed. Sarah Keller's family has waited 34 years for answers. Stillwater has lived under the shadow of this crime for more than 3 decades. The truth, however belated, brings its own form of justice." The funeral for Sarah Keller took place on June 15, 2021, in the garden of the Merged Church, where she once sang in the choir. The day was clear and warm, the kind of early summer weather that Sarah had loved, according to the memories shared by those who had known her. The steel mill had long since been demolished, the property overtaken by nature. But former workers and their families came to pay respects, people who had filled prescriptions at Rebecca's pharmacy for decades, who remembered Sarah as a bright, ambitious young woman, with a warm smile and gentle hands when administering vaccines or taking blood pressure. Detective Hargrove stood beside Rebecca, as Sarah's remains were finally laid to rest beside her father. His tall frame stooped with age, but his presence as steady as it had been throughout the long investigation. The minister spoke of closure, of justice, of a community healing from a wound that had festered unacknowledged for too long. The headstone, simple granite, read, "Sarah Elizabeth Keller, 1964-1987. Beloved daughter, seeker of truth." After the service, Rebecca invited a small group back to her home. Hargrove, Martha Gaines, who had traveled from Florida despite her health, Pastor Williams, and a few of Sarah's closest friends from nursing school. They gathered in the living room, where Sarah's photograph still held the place of honor on the mantel, sharing memories that focused on her life rather than her death, gradually shifting the narrative from tragedy to celebration of the person she had been. As the afternoon faded into evening and guests began to leave, Rebecca found herself alone with Hargrove on the front porch, the same porch where he had first interviewed her 34 years earlier, when Sarah had been missing less than 48 hours, and hope still seemed reasonable. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly, the question encompassing the vast empty space that justice had created, the absence of purpose after decades of waiting, searching, hoping. Rebecca looked out over her garden, where daisies nodded in the fading light. "I'm selling the pharmacy," she said. "There's a young pharmacist from Columbus who wants to keep it independent, not sell out to one of the chains. She reminds me a little of Sarah, ambitious, detail-oriented." A small smile touched her lips. "I'm going to volunteer with the Cold Case Victims Support Group in Cincinnati, help other families waiting for answers." Hargrove nodded, understanding the need to transform decades of pain into purposeful action. "Sarah would be proud of you," he said simply. "She would be proud of you too, Roy," Rebecca replied, using his first name for perhaps the first time in their long acquaintance. "You never gave up on her, and I was just a receptionist." When the guilty verdict was read, Rebecca Keller sat motionless in the courtroom, her hands folded around Sarah's silver charm bracelet. Dr. Maxwell, his professional demeanor finally cracking, turned to face her. "She would have ruined everything," he said, his voice carrying in the silent courtroom. "She found my journals. She knew what I was. It was the only explanation he would ever offer." The funeral for Sarah Keller took place on June 15, 2021, in the garden of the Merged Church, where she once sang in the choir. The steel mill had long since been demolished, but former workers and their families came to pay respects. Detective Hargrove stood beside Rebecca, as Sarah's remains were finally laid to rest beside her father. The headstone, simple granite, read, "Sarah Elizabeth Keller, 1964-1987. Beloved daughter, seeker of truth. Rebecca returned to her home that evening, to the bedroom where the phone had rung at 3:42 a.m. 2 months earlier. The boxes from Sarah's apartment, untouched for 34 years, were finally opened. Among Sarah's possessions was an acceptance letter from Ohio State University Medical School, dated March 10, 1987, 2 days before she disappeared. "We are pleased to offer you admission," it read, "and have noted your interest in forensic pathology." The pharmacy closed permanently the following week, its inventory sold to a chain store in the next county. Rebecca moved to Cincinnati to be closer to her sister, taking with her only photographs and Sarah's notebooks. Stillwater continued its slow decline. Another small town hollowed out by economic change and hidden tragedies. But something had been restored, not just to Rebecca Keller, but to a community built on a foundation of misplaced trust. A truth, however painful, had replaced decades of uncertainty. The snow falls differently now on the streets of Stillwater, no longer covering secrets, but cleansing them. Those who remember still speak of Sarah Keller, not as the victim of Stillwater's darkest chapter, but as the young woman whose truth, finally revealed, forced a community to recognize that monsters sometimes wear white coats and deliver babies and sit in the front pew at church. The phone no longer startles Rebecca Keller in the middle of the night. The questions have been answered. The waiting has ended. Decades may bury evidence, but truth finds its way to the surface. Where were you when justice finally came to Stillwater? Stories like this wait in small towns across America, in evidence lockers and attic boxes, and the memories of those who never stopped asking questions. Remember them, so that silence never again protects those who hide behind respected facades.